was never going to be a men's physique.
Didn't have much of an off season.
I like his physique better.
I'm always very energetic. I will have to put me as one of the greatest.
Mr. Olympia was won by the back.
So, Rick, I was looking forward to talking to you, man. You are the America's lawyer for the bodybuilding industry, the fitness industry, and the supplementation industry, right?
I am. Thank you. Yes.
And you know,
something I love. Absolutely.
For sure, man. And you know, I interview a lot of people from the industry. Most of them are bodybuilders, I would say. A lot of coaches, and also I start interviewing doctors as well for practical advice. But you're the first lawyer, man. So I'm
See that? All right. Well, I'm honored, brother. Thank
yeah,
you.
for sure, man. So, you know, I kind of want to get to know you a little bit more about your background in law. From what I understand, you consider to be the authority on the subject of laws in the area of human performing drugs. You're the counsel to IABB, right? And you also
Yes.
used to be a former prosecutor.
Yes. Yes.
So tell me, how did you?
A former competitive bodybuilder as well. So I've kind of walked the walk, lad, and yeah, it's for me it's a very cool thing. You know, I was a bodybuilder before I was a lawyer. So I competed in bodybuilding when I was in college, in my late teens and early 20s. And then I went to law school. I became, as you say, a prosecutor. I was an assistant district attorney, which was a great job, you know, fighting crime on the streets and you know, and then like many prosecutors, switched sides and went to the defense side. And I represented a lot of people on everything from low-level crimes to serious felonies to major drug trafficking cases to homicide cases, and I did that for a few years. And ultimately, you know, sometimes in life, you know, your two worlds collide or merge. And so I had my world as a bodybuilder, as a personal trainer. I worked my way through college as a personal trainer. I was a day manager in gyms. I had been in the gym culture almost, you know, since I was in my early teens, and that life was separate from my legal career, from my career path. And sometimes life has some strange ways of kind of putting you in the place you're ultimately supposed to be. And the year that I went into private practice, left the district attorney's office, was the year that Congress criminalized anabolic steroids, took anabolic steroids and put them into that same classification, that same law as other narcotics and recreational drugs.
What year was that?
What's that?
What year was that when they
That was
criminalized it?
1990.
1990. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so you had a time there where before that, steroids were kind of like, you know, super vitamins. They were used by people in the bodybuilding community, which was a very, very small fringe community before then. And so you really didn't have a lot of knowledge on either side. So you had the guys in the gyms who didn't understand that now what they had been using is now similar to Vicodin or in the same act as cocaine and heroin. And you had the people in the courts, the prosecutors, the judges, even the defense lawyers and the cops who really had no idea what was going on in the gyms and what these bodybuilders, what the effects of steroids were. And so I became sort of the bridge between those two things, between the gym world and the legal world. And my practice ultimately expanded to the point where that's really all I do is represent people in the bodybuilding community, either in criminal cases involving steroids, in doping cases involving banned substances that they test positive for, and as well as in sort of the health and fitness community for supplements, sports nutrition products. My firm represents a lot of brands in the sports nutrition space.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me as sort of a health and fitness kid, as growing up, to be able to kind of have a life that blends my passions with my vocation and avocation into one. I'm the happiest kid on the block.
That's great, man. So you mentioned 1991 is when the government criminalized, made it criminal to have steroids, right? To use steroids. Now,
The law went into effect in 91.
so prior to that, they were still banned in professional sports, correct? Or was it also a gray area there?
Yeah, so in like the 80s, there were reports that started to come around about professional sports and even high school sports, amateur sports, and steroids and performance drugs starting to be an issue. And Congress held a bunch of hearings. Sports had already, the big sports had already begun the process of, making it a violation of the rules, and to start testing for it. But in 1988, Ben Johnson, the Canadian sprinter who beat Carl Lewis in the '88 Seoul Olympics, tested positive for stanozolol, for Winstrol, and suddenly Congress went nuts. And what sports leagues were doing was determined not to be enough. Congress needed to act. Congress needed to set a law saying that you can't use these things for other than a valid medical reason. And so hearings were held, and a number of senators and Congress people pushed hard to put steroids into the same act with other drugs like heroin and cocaine, even though the evidence about addiction at that time, which is really kind of necessary, a dependency issue, abuse and dependency kind of criteria, really wasn't a lot of evidence at that time for it. But Congress wanted to get it out of sports. And so the law went into effect. And the reality is probably steroids became more part of sports after that law went into effect. I don't think it really kept it out of sports at all. And most of the people who were arrested and prosecuted under that law were recreational bodybuilders who were either looking to look better on the beach or competing in bodybuilding, or were selling or distributing to other people who wanted to do those things.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, to me, you mentioned different types of drugs, right? To me, when it comes to steroids, it's similar to painkillers, right? Because painkillers are illegal if they're used in dosages that are not prescribed by the doctor. So steroids fall in the same category, right? It's not cocaine or heroin, but like you can get a prescription from a doctor. But when we're talking about steroids, like when we have a conversation about steroids and bodybuilding, we're talking about completely different dosages, right? Like in comparison, basically, the bodybuilder would take, in comparison, like prescription would, let's say, give it to you a dosage for a week. They would take it in a day, right? So it's completely different dosages. So in that instance, makes it illegal, right?
So steroids are category 3, schedule 3, which is similar to Vicodin and other painkillers. Cocaine is schedule 2. Heroin and marijuana is schedule 1, which means you can't give it out for any medical purpose whatsoever. But yeah, it's similar to the idea that the dosages are certainly different, and for a doctor to prescribe it, it's got to be for a medical purpose. It can't be to get bigger or to compete in bodybuilding. I don't know if you've ever had Chris Bell on your podcast. Chris Bell, it was the director of that movie, Bigger, Stronger, Faster.
Yeah, for sure. I know Chris.
So Chris is a good friend of mine, and he covered these issues very well in the movie. I'm in that movie too. So in terms of sort of how steroids have kind of, become what they are in American law, culture, politics, medicine, that's a great movie for it.
No, for sure. No, I agree with you. Now, when it comes to penalties, right, do they vary from state to state, or is it just a federal ban and you fall under a federal jurisdiction?
Yeah, so we've got a complicated system in this country where you've got the federal law that applies in every state, and then you've got individual state laws that only apply in that individual state. So, for example, under federal law, if you had, let's say, 5 pills, 5, Anadrol tablets, let's say, under federal law, unless you were actually selling it or there was evidence that you were distributing it, that it would be a misdemeanor. But in some states, that mere possession of any amount, 1 tablet, 1 10cc vial, is a felony. So it varies by state. Different states define steroids differently. And plea bargaining and the way people are treated in different states can actually even vary by county. So in some places, in some cities, it's much more relaxed. In certain parts of the country, it's any kind of drug case is looked at very, very seriously, even for a small amount.
So what you're saying is any bodybuilder who's using anabolics is basically at risk of being arrested and potentially going to prison just for personal use. They're not selling it; they're just using it. They're at
Yep,
risk.
under our law, which is interesting because, not every country does it that way. So in the United Kingdom, for example, small personal use amount, that you're not getting arrested for that. Distribution, that's a different story. Even in Canada, small personal use amount, not a crime in Canada. The US, I think, has taken a much more aggressive approach to drugs in general, sort of the war on drugs. And when steroids got kind of lumped into that same category, that same Controlled Substances Act, they basically became part of this war on drugs mentality. So it's yes, even a small amount. Obviously, if you have a valid prescription, that's a different story. But if you don't have a prescription and you're in possession of any amount of anabolic steroids in the United States, you are in violation of the law.
That's very interesting, because so what kind of penalty? I mean, like, let's say from a regular, just amateur bodybuilder perspective, you know what I mean? What can he be facing really? I mean, I know that obviously you got to be kind of unlucky. I'm assuming, right, to get caught if if you're not selling it. You know what I mean?
Right.
But
Yeah. So I guess the biggest risk, obviously, if you're selling it, there's a number of different ways that you can get jammed up, and the penalties will, in large measure, be associated with how much you were distributing. If you're a low-level distributor versus if you're an underground lab and you've got, they come in and they find kilos of raw powder that came from China, et cetera, you're going to be looking at a federal case with potentially a lot more exposure. But for the average guy or the average bodybuilder who is, just in possession of a small amount, the biggest risk is on the acquisition, right? Once it's in your house, I have seen some cases where an angry spouse will drop a call to the police and say, he's got steroids in the house and he just punched me, and suddenly people get popped for that. But for most people, it's acquiring the drugs. So if it's delivered via the U.S. mail and it opens, or the police have a reason to open the package and they find it, that can be a way that could lead ultimately to an arrest. If it's in your car, just acquiring is the main risk. People should know that in order for law enforcement to open a package in the mail, let's say there's a package addressed to you, if it's a domestic package, they need a warrant in order to open up that package. They can't just open that package. But if it's an international parcel, it's coming from China, from India, overseas, then they can open it under sort of a border search exemption or the requirement. So an international package is at risk to be opened for, any good reason that they think they want to open it for.
Interesting. Do you think the feds are actively looking to crack down on steroids in the United States? Pursue cases of individual users and go after them? Is that happening?
Definitely. But do I think it's a priority over certainly oxys and meth, have been major problems in the country. And so the opiate crisis, I think, has diverted some of the attention away from steroids. But there are definitely agents, and I deal with them. I have cases all the time involving DEA agents. Sometimes it's postal inspectors who will find something in the mail. Sometimes it's customs, Homeland Security folks will get an international package. And then if you've got a kilo of testosterone powder coming to somebody's house in, Iowa, they're not going to just let that go. That's going to be delivered there under controlled circumstances, what they call a controlled delivery. And once the recipient takes that package and brings it into their house, a search warrant is executed and you have 10 feds in the house going through. And then once that guy gets popped, very often most of the people in the steroid trade, unlike maybe, hardcore drugs or narcotics, most have no criminal record. Most are, gainfully employed people who are either bodybuilders themselves or were bodybuilders. And so sometimes they've got families, they've got jobs, they've got a lot to lose. And the remedy that the road that they take is to say, hey, look, I know 3 or 4 other underground labs. And so now the agents are turned on to 3 or 4 other targets, and they're not going to just ignore that, Vlad. So they're going to go out and they're going to pursue. So I don't think it's a main priority of DEA, but there's certainly enough of those cases that I've traveled to probably half the states in America on steroid cases, mostly now trafficking cases, mostly underground labs that are getting popped. You don't see as many individual personal users get popped as often as maybe 10 or 15 years ago, but it still happens.